All right, welcome to another edition of the War Room. Today is Wednesday, May 4th. We've gathered together our team of experts to just talk a little bit about what we see going on in the economy, what we see going on around the world, and just what we want to keep an eye on. I am Eric L. Dunavant. I am the president and founder of the Kingdom ROI family of companies. Joining me is Drew Brown, our CEO. We've got Carson Rich in studio with us, who is our research analyst. And then joining us via broadcast is Kristina Schuler, who is our lead advisor for Paradigm Intentional Ownership Division of our company. And as always, the goal is just to spend some time. If you're not familiar, Carson produces a report every week, every Monday, called the Rich Report, which just sends out general information. This is our time to come together and let Carson just kind of walk us through some of the highlights, the bigger picture of what we've seen inside of the Rich Report over the last couple of weeks. And let's just continue the dialogue and conversation around what we need to be watching, what we want to keep our eyes on, and kind of what maybe the future pretends. I guess we're going to kind of look into a crystal ball, even though we don't have one, but we're going to do our best to use common sense and see what the world tells us. So with that, Carson.
Let's do it.
What do you see?
Let's get started. So starting off with Canada, news from Canada. There's a lot of exciting things today, by the way. Specifically over in Canada, we've got some things going on with Alberta. And Alberta is planning a 2026 referendum that's going to be Bill 54 to explore breaking away from Canada. And I want to see, this is fueled, by the way, by their frustrations over oil and gas restrictions. I want to see what y'all's thoughts are about this specific topic, because it's interesting. Before Trump was elected president, he was talking about sort of having Canada possibly becoming a 51st state, and something that obviously he got lots of backlash on from Canada. But just a couple stats that I could give you before I ask you this question. Alberta specifically contributes 20% of Canada's contributes to 20% of Canada's overall GDP, while only being 11% of its population. And Alberta's oil and gas sector accounts for 15% of Canada's total energy exports. And the point behind all this, Canada elected the Liberal Party, the more progressive party again, just recently. Alberta leans a little bit more conservative. So, number one, do you think that Alberta could sustain itself given these numbers? And do you think that there's a possibility of Alberta becoming a 51st state? What do y'all think about that?
Well, I'm going to actually jump over those two questions a bit, because I think that for me, the biggest question in regard to that is, number one, will Texas be really jealous if Alberta actually is the first to be able to successfully secede from something, from a country?
I agree. Yeah.
But no, that's not where I was going with that. But the question to me is, what does it do to Canada more than what does it do to Alberta? Because Alberta will have, regardless, if something like this were to actually happen, then the new country, so to speak, whatever that is, the new country, they're going to have lots of challenges on many fronts. It's just because there are some things that are going to have to be starting from scratch. They're going to have to develop their own political system that's not Canadian.
They've got to figure out trade.
Well, I think that they're probably already down the road on that.
Okay.
Well, their biggest trade partner is the U.S., and that would be a pretty simple step for them, because the U.S. would probably step in, especially with this administration.
Yeah.
Step in and be a kind of a big brother in that situation. I'm pretty certain of that. But there's going to be difficulty, right? So there's not any way that this is going to be a seamless, smooth thing for Alberta. However, and I'm going to throw in one little extra thing in this, is that this has happened over and over and over again in the history of shifting nations. Mm-hmm. When Yugoslavia broke away. I mean, when communism fell in Yugoslavia, which was a kind of a smash mix of several countries made into one, when they all divided out again, the smallest country of them all was Slovenia. So it's Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia. There was a collection of countries that used to be Yugoslavia, but the smallest country of them all, Slovenia, was in a similar situation in that they produced the lion's share of GDP for the whole group of the whole quote unquote country, and they got no respect. I mean, they also were kind of looked down on by all the other people groups, and so they had to kind of come in and prove themselves, but they also had all of the infrastructure for it, and so their climb economically was easier overall than even the other countries were, kind of becoming part of the West. And so I look at something like that because I think that historically that same situation has happened over and over again. So I have no doubt that Alberta could establish themselves as a country. I'm sure it would be a challenging road for them.
Of course.
But if they step away from Canada, that leaves a huge hole in Canada that I don't think they're prepared to know how to fill.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth keeping an eye on from what you're talking about and what it does for Canada. I'm going to come around a back end of a different way. I want to look at this from an oil and gas standpoint. Because you're looking at that's what they're frustrated, right, about the restrictions on their ability to produce more oil and gas.
Correct.
At the point that the U.S. is becoming energy independent, at a point that we're needing more energy than ever, while also at the point, just interestingly, if I'm reading the statistics right, we're watching the world become less dependent on oil and gas than it has been before. Not that it would go away, but finding other alternative sources. And so I'm more curious about the direction. I mean, what comes up for you? I'm going to agree with everything that you've said, but what comes up for me is in a time when the U.S. is going to need more energy, having a partner to the north, directly to the north, that has the same desire to be able to produce more energy is very compelling. But what does that mean for the energy desire and need? And I think we're going to get into a greater discussion too about what does this mean around nuclear and how do we think about. And so when I look towards the future, we definitely know we're going to have greater energy demand. I think the question that comes up for me is which types of energy, as I'm thinking about policy and how we're going to think about our investment portfolios, which types of energy out there are going to fill that demand the greatest, and how do we keep an eye on that?
Well, I think it's really it's a really good time that there's a lot of push going on from a lot of policy circles for the all of the above approach, right? I mean, there's a lot. I don't know if you've heard as much as on that, but there's a lot of conversation around. We have to stop saying this or that, or if you're for fossil fuels, then you're against clean energy and all of that. For the future of humankind and the world at large, having an all above approach with a very clean attitude toward clean energy in terms of even the petroleum industry, that we just do it as clean as possible, which most of those large companies are already producing at a rate in terms of not leaving a bad footprint, right, where they're working. It's a whole new world from what it used to be.
Right. Yeah.
So here's an interesting thing in regard to what you're saying, though, Eric, in terms of Canada, that I've been following the Canada energy thing for several years now, and some of the largest deposits in the world are in Canada, and they've got several what you would look at, and from the way we kind of look at companies in terms of if they're strong companies, if they're good stable companies. They have several in their energy industry there that would qualify under this, but they really are having a hard time getting traction because of all the regulation. They've got to go to snail's pace. They can't develop the fields that they have like they would like. There's just all kinds of things that are in the way. And I just wonder. Here's my wondering here. I wonder if they were able to get out from under Canada's liberal regulation policy standards, if them with partnering with the U.S. in the energy sector, that wouldn't just take that wouldn't the whole Canada energy thing would go to another level.
Be interesting.
That was my exact thought process. Yeah, and then what you said about clean energy, that to me that seems like the status quo. Like that's the thing now. And obviously part of my job, I'm looking at a lot of the websites for specific companies that are in the energy sector, and almost everybody is explaining how they're interested in being innovative and focusing on clean energy, and it's sort of the thing to do now. So that is the future. Trump specifically is drill baby drill and things like that. I've heard him talk negatively about wind and solar and things like that. But yeah, I mean, this is all just very interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, I want to add one other thing, because I was last week, we went out to California for our mission trip, and I drove back with Austin. And we stayed in a town called Artesia, New Mexico, which Drew will know, which is out in West Texas. And the next 20 to 30 miles was all oil derricks. Okay, but here's what was interesting. That, again, I just would keep an eye on it. It might be worth you doing some more research on. I saw one derrick pumping. I went 20 miles, and I'm talking like an oil derrick, I mean, not literally from me to where Drew is, but I mean, you could throw a rock from each derrick to each derrick. It wasn't like it was a derrick and then like a mile and another derrick. No, this was just lots and tons of derrick. And then two towns, at least that we drove through, that didn't have anything, like no other support other than oil and gas infrastructure support they weren't, I don't even, you'd call them towns. Okay. So that's first, one derrick pumping out of all of those. So I was like, wow, okay, that's something, just go back to common sense. But the other thing too, I know that you can have people who will talk down on alternative forms of energy, except for the fact I would say like, okay, but in places that have a lot of sunlight, if you can get solar in places that have a lot of sunlight, that seems to make sense. With the second thing being that we passed by, which Drew will also know outside of Sweetwater, Texas, is basically one of the largest windmill farms you will ever see.
They're everywhere, yeah.
Almost the same
and
thing.
And now filling in between Sweetwater and Lubbock. It's all filling in all the way through Snyder.
Right, so what do they have there? Tons of wind. Right, so in a place that already has putting a wind generator somewhere there's no wind would be foolish.
Correct.
Putting a wind generator somewhere there is where there's a lot of wind could be really valuable. And so I don't want to get caught up a lot on energy but it really jumped out was you guys were having that conversation about, man, I forgot that I drove by 20 miles worth of oil wells and only one was pumping.
I think that's the thing. That's sort of Trump's perspective is like, how much money are we just sitting on, basically? He's very economics driven, obviously. Sure. So it's like, what's the opportunity cost of not, of using all that oil? So, but yeah, that's all.
Good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to Europe. So the EU and the US are still negotiating. We've got till July 9th to figure something out. Essentially what's going on there is we have Trump raised, as of today, this is active now, specifically for the EU, there's now 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel. Everybody else is half that, is 25%. And what he wants to do is go to 50% for all EU goods. And what that affects, for the most part, if you think in terms of what we get from the EU, the largest portion of that is automobiles. So my question would be, so obviously this is still in negotiation. We're going to see, July 9th, what's actually going to happen here. My question would be, as far as a consumer standpoint, because everybody's worried about costs going up because of these tariffs. My question is, if you think about what cars come from the EU, I'll just list a few off the bat. Lamborghini, Ferrari, BMW, Mercedes-Benz.
VW.
Yeah. And, the cheapest... Porsche.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
absolutely.
I was just saying, I've got 3 of those 4 cars sitting in my driveway right now.
Yeah, yeah. The cheapest brand that I can think of that comes from the EU is Volkswagen.
The Cooper Mini
Yeah, the Mini Cooper.
and
yep.
the Fiat. We have some Fiats.
Yeah, Fiat. That is true. So my thought process, and similar to we've talked before about the company Toll Brothers and how they're a higher end company, and it makes sense that the people that are buying Toll Brothers homes have the money for Toll Brothers homes and will probably still have the money for Toll Brothers homes. And so my question is, do you think that the people that can afford Mercedes, BMW, Porsche, etc., because those are a lot of the cars that are coming over, do you think that those people could still afford those cars? My thought process is that is for the most part, upper class cars. So
It's definitely upper class cars. I'm going to give a different opinion on that. In that, here's why I don't think it's going to be as extreme as it is. Because the people who have the money have the influence. Like it or not, those are the people who speak into and will complain, not in front of people, but behind closed doors about that. Like, hey, look, this is what you're doing to our cars. And I mean, it's the way that we don't have to like this, but it's the reason the estate tax conversation goes the way that it goes. It's the reason that a lot of tax policy goes, is because it's the people with money who are having the conversations. And so it's one of those things kind of keep an eye on. But to think that there's going to be 50% tariffs on those vehicles at the end, when all is said and done, I don't believe it yet.
Well, and there's we've talked about this before in the war room, and it is we have to leave the verdict unsettled until it's settled.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Because the ability of companies to adapt to tariff situations, if they're strong companies. And a lot of these car companies are have been. You just can't underestimate or overestimate that at this point. We just have to watch and see what happens with that. In the case of and by the way, there are several European cars like Volvo and mid-range, like good mid-range cars that come over from Europe that.
Subaru is a European car, is it not?
Oh, is it?
It's Subaru is it Korean or is it?
Okay,
it's one
wrong.
It's one of the Asian.
I could be wrong.
But I don't know the answer to that. I was guessing. Where was I going with that? That a lot of these companies, the option and what the pressure, part of the whole pressure is on this is to get if they're doing high volume. If they're companies that can do high volume in car sales, Trump wants them building manufacturing plants over here.
Correct.
Okay. If they start talking about if we don't have manufacturing plants in the U.S. right now, we want to talk about doing that, that he'll come back and say, well, then we'll make a tariff agreement with you in the meantime while you're doing that in order to support you coming and building and building and selling from the States.
Yep.
So there's that whole piece. So the companies that don't do high volume, like Ferrari, okay, then the price point of those are way beyond cost of manufacturing. So their ability to adjust and absorb some of that is very high.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying it's still one of those things where watching how the companies adapt to this overall is still really important. We have the ability of companies to adapt. I think we have to factor that in. I'm not convinced yet that this whole tariff thing simply means that all these goods are going to be, so much more higher price than they are.
And I think basic pattern recognition tells us that when Trump says, I'm going to put a 50% tariff on all EU goods, that doesn't necessarily mean he wants to put a 50% tariff on all EU goods. That means he wants to have a conversation and he wants to have some leverage. Maybe he wants to bluff or he wants to threat. And we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But I think one thing I think we know for certain is that Trump is managing a trade deficit, and he wants that down. And, number two, he wants these companies to manufacture in the U.S. And I think those are the two goals that he's shooting for.
Well, I mean, let's talk about this a little bit, which I think is like if you were to look at global markets right now, and I want to make sure we have enough time to get into our other stuff too here, but if you were to look at global markets right now, there are a lot of people, like international, I think is outperforming year to date than domestic is in the U.S., right? Which is rare. It hasn't happened in quite a few years. International's actually quite underperformed, especially over the last 5 to 10 years versus the other markets. But it's one of the reasons I think that as a team, we've been so bullish on looking more domestically as opposed to looking internationally is because of the policies of the administration wanting more growth to be happening here, wanting more investing to be happening here. So if you were to look at just our overall thinking and kind of ask, what is that, what's the theme that this leads to? What's the kind, this is the reason longer term, I'm personally more bullish on what's happening domestically than I am on what's happening globally.
So you think of the entire country as a growth stock, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and to add on to that, like a good for instance of that is what Trump's trying to do with U.S. Steel right now.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and the whole thing of upping the tariff a little higher on steel, and then him engaging with is it Nippon is the company that's wanting to
Nippon, yeah, that's how I'd say it.
And so that whole thing, in order to get that part of the industry jump started. Steel was one of our strongest manufacturing industry components historically, and so that's he's wanting to see that again. So it's kind of bringing back in the strength of our industrial sectors on the U.S. side.
So we'll just a few more things with Europe that I was looking at I thought was interesting. In Poland, they just elected a new president. This is Karol, I'm going to say Nawrocki. And he's a hard right guy. He's a nationalist guy. He's somewhat anti-EU. And so a few things I was thinking of about this specific presidential win over in Poland is they've been a key supporter of Ukraine with $3 billion in military aid and 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees hosted. And also, NATO allocated $137 billion to Poland between 2021 and 2027. So I think, possibly the risk here, depending on how much of an anti-EU stance that Poland takes, is do they lose that funding, or do they lose some of that funding, or maybe after 2027 or whatever it is, and then how much is this administration going to support additional funding for Ukraine? And I just think it's an interesting thing to see. A lot of these European countries are electing presidents on the more nationalist side. Germany, we'll talk about in a second, is looking like almost the opposite in terms of they are very interested in support for Ukraine. We'll talk about why in a second. But anything you'll want to say about Poland?
Yeah, well, let me give some color to that, because even some of the language, I would caution whenever we're talking about the international scene, and especially Europe, their definitions of hard right and left and center and all of that are actually very different than the way U.S. defines those things. They're trying to use them multilaterally. In other words, trying to use the same definitional things back and forth, and it's not a wise thing right now, because they don't mean the same thing. And so I'm not sure how hard right Karol is on that. He is, from a nationalistic standpoint, he's definitely high independent. That's the anti-EU part of that. In other words, but Poland's been that way for a long time. I mean, they've had this liberal, their prime minister, and this is important. that a lot of these countries that operate, I can say this, off of parliamentarian a system, they'll have a president and a prime minister, and so you have a prime minister who is of the Liberal Party, one of the Liberal parties there, or coalition, and then you have the new president, the prime minister, and then you have the new president, who's more on the right on that, and so you actually have two guys in place that are juxtaposing each other. Okay, and so that it's important to see that in regard to this. So he becomes more of a balance out, or a kind of what we would call a checks and balances system there in Poland with that. In terms of the funding, though, the NATO funding, that sources out and decisions are made on a different level based off the NATO countries rather than the EU funding. And so I'm not sure that Poland's really been big on EU funding for a long time. They've been very fiscally conservative ever since they came into the West, and have been more sound in their fiscal policy than almost any other EU country.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much at risk financially they are in terms of the.
Well, I agree with what you said, and I think that obviously since the World Wars, Poland has had something to prove. That basically, they've got to prove that they can be independent and they can have secure borders specifically, which they are doing a good job of, and they are actually one of the most rapidly growing economies, and so I do think that. You're probably right. The hard right thing might not actually mean hard right. I know specifically this Carroll guy is it falls almost very close in line with Trump's policies as far as focusing on a secure border and things like that. Poland has the most secure border in Europe, I would say. People will occasionally try to sneak across the border and they'll shoot them on the spot. People don't just cross the border in Poland. So that's like their number one thing. Defense is what they spend a lot of their money on. But like I said, their economy is growing very rapidly. And I think in the future, kind of like we said, America as a whole, the country is sort of like a growth economy, and that's what we're seeing. I think Poland is sort of has that similarity with the United States. They're a growing economy, and yeah, so I think this guy is probably a perfect fit for Poland, and like I said, they have something to prove. I think that this guy could be the at least help them get him there. So, well,
it's one of those things where we'll see whether how far he pushes things and whether it goes in a good direction or not. But but Paul, I mean, he fits the historical trajectory,
right,
of Poland.
That's what I was trying to say.
Since the fall of communism. So
I'll add just a real quick thing. I think the bigger thing here to watch regarding your commentary is we saw the UK do it. I have read a lot of things that have just said that the EU as an organization, the structure of it is not built for longevity. And so as different countries come in and express the desire not to be a part of the EU anymore, that's the bigger picture thing that I'm watching and paying attention to from an economic standpoint and kind of my business mind is I'm like, okay, I get that you can single out Poland, but I'm like, look at how UK has already pulled themselves out of the EU. And over time, who might be the next countries to slowly pull out, and what does the EU look like in 10 to 15 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the interesting thing about Poland is that they're uniquely positioned because of their economic soundness. They've not been a super fast growing economy. They've just been a super steady growing economy. When a lot of the other countries have been up, down, or backwards, or whatever, whenever crashes happen, everybody hits the bottom. Poland doesn't. It just stays in that trajectory, and steady and growing. So they're uniquely positioned to be able to be one of the stronger elbows, right? The stronger arms in what happens with the EU going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm assuming from the people's standpoint, the point might be that they don't want the EU to have as much control over their
That's true.
country.
That's true.
So I think that's what the sort of anti-EU there specifically is what that means.
Yeah, they're just not as outspoken about it as Hungary is.
Right, yeah. So moving on to Germany, like I said, we've got an opposite situation in terms of Ukraine. So the new Chancellor Merz, lifted range limits on weapons to Ukraine, allowing strikes on Russian targets. So the problem with this is Russia warned of quote-unquote consequences for NATO weapons used on its soil. I'll say that 50% of Germans oppose deeper involvement with that war specifically. And my question is, could this lead to other NATO countries to get more involved, especially if Russia retaliates? That would be the sort of the thinking is, Germany's here now, and then, who else is next? France, so on and so forth. Is that sort of the dark side, I guess, of what?
Yeah. Well, it's how close do we want to get to the nuclear game in terms of weapons? And because Russia started out with that threat. I mean, they brought that on the table very early on in the whole war conflict, and us trying to tell them to stop, and the fact that we were supporting, logistically supporting Ukraine, and all of the EU allies were, and the NATO allies. Russia was saying, there's a line too far here, and the nuclear option is an option. So it's how far do we want to play that, and is Putin of a mentality that that's a viable option to him?
Well, if the stories are correct, I didn't get to read all I saw were the headlines before I left, but basically Trump came out today and said that they're pretty far apart on any negotiations.
Oh, yeah,
slowing
that's
things
right.
down.
Mm-hmm, that's
Ukraine.
right.
So again, for the sake of time, I think that's worth of putting a pin in and watching.
Because it's not getting resolved.
We're not going to figure that out today.
Close timing.
So over in the Middle East, finally, Israel allowed 90 UN aid trucks into Gaza. Shortages persist, though. The UN says that the 90 trucks allowed in is nowhere near enough to address the shortages. This blockade has been going on, by the way, for 11 weeks now. 80% of Gazans lack clean water, and 60% are struggling to get enough food. And 22 countries have demanded full resumption of aid. A few are threatening sanctions. So that's what's going on over there. I guess the good news, though, is that they did allow a few of these aid trucks in. Not enough, but we'll see. We'll see if more can get in and address these shortages. Netanyahu announced the killing of a Gaza chief, which is something that keeps happening. I'm sure y'all have at least seen this has happened multiple times, and Hamas will just keep putting a new chief in charge, and then Israel will kill them. So this is nothing new. It's almost like it's sort of expected. So Israel accepted something that the United States drafted up in terms of a ceasefire. Hamas wants a permanent end to the war, and Israel is demanding Hamas's disarmament and exile of its leaders. So Trump, kind of like you were bringing up with the Ukraine, and it's the same situation. Trump is getting frustrated by the prolonging of the war. And my question would be, is it possible that the U.S. take a step back from its support for Israel in this situation, or no opinion on that? What do you think?
Well, I think that the complexness, not complicatedness, the complexity
There you go.
of that situation is it's hard to really assess it from this standpoint. It's hard enough to assess it with the political leaders that are involved right in it, but here's the reality: is we have no idea what information we can rely on. We have no idea if Hamas is and their Ministry of Health and all of their the numbers that they're giving to the news organization. We have no idea how reliable they are. There's this big back and forth already of the approved U.S. aid group that they'll let go in.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole blockade thing from Israel's point of view is that all that aid goes to Hamas. It doesn't go to the people anyway. So why are they going to keep bringing in more and more of it that goes to Hamas? That's their point of view. Of course, from Gaza's point of view is that you're blocking the aid that we need.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got, there's your 2 points of view. The thing is that we have no idea what actual information we can rely on in regard to a lot of that. And so a cease to the war, does that bring back the status quo of a Hamas that's still committed and keeps trying to work and digging tunnels and getting bombs from Iran and trying to destroy Israel? Is that the norm we go back to? Or, in other words, what is a permanent end to the war? What does that look like? And for whom? For Gaza or for that? So it's one of those things where even what the frustration is all about, it's what are we really looking toward, and what is going to be the product of this after whatever agreements are made.
Yeah.
And historically, Hamas has never ultimately agreed to whatever proposal has been brought.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. And then what's being reported is that the permanent end to the war is we'll mind our business, you mind your business in our own places. But like you said, we don't know for sure, the details or the statistics.
Well, if the leaders are still groups that their whole purpose is to destroy the state of Israel,
mm-hmm.
or to destroy Israel off the face of the earth, then there's no way they're going to mind their own business.
Right.
Regardless of what they promise. So
Right.
I think the bigger issue is, this is a conflict that's been going on my entire lifetime. It's just carried different flavors. It's gone on before I've been here. It's gone on before you've been here, and it's not going anywhere.
I agree.
Well, which is, that is Netanyahu's viewpoint.
Right.
Like if we don't end it permanently, it's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. It's just going to go back to the same kind of place it's always been, which means that the conflict is still there. So how do you we'll see. For us, I think one of the things that in watching this is that our ally position with Israel has meant a lot economically. In other words, we're economically tied in with them pretty deeply in terms of import-export and their innovation, the innovation that comes out of Israel and how that benefits U.S. So, that's to me, that's where I'd be interested to know how that kind of fleshes out as this.
Well, and I think that continues. That's one of the things that we've seen. It's one of the reasons that, in the past we've had an Israel portfolio. Was that the amount of innovation that comes out of that country? I think that most people don't know and would be amazed and surprised by a country that's the size of New Jersey and how much innovation comes out of that country, which is the reason it's worth continuing the dialogue and the conversations.
Yeah, and staying connected to them. I don't think there's a chance that we are not an ally of Israel.
I agree, only because if we were going to, we would have a long time ago. We would have stopped being allies, before now. I don't think what's going on now would be sort of the trigger for that situation. So Iran, not much to say other than they rejected the proposed nuclear deal. Iran basically said that it's none of our business if they develop nuclear capabilities. They want us out of their business. Mm-hmm. And they're on pace to have nuclear weapon capabilities by next year, by 2026. So that's a situation that we'll watch in terms of, are we going to keep trying for a nuclear deal? Things like that. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk specifically about Trump. One of the things he threatened in terms of tariffs was specifically for the company Apple, which I don't think that has ever happened before. That there's a tariff on one specific company, and obviously his goal there is he wants iPhones to be made in America. So Tim Cook, the CEO, says that they rely on China for skilled labor, not cheap labor. So I guess the thought process is that we use China because they're cheaper, and we can make the phones for cheaper if we use China for the labor. And Tim Cook was saying it's not necessarily cheaper; they're just more skilled, and that was sort of his rebuttal to Trump, was that we don't have enough skilled laborers for this product in America. So my thought is, if it's not the pay, if it's not the fact that they're cheap labor, I would assume you could find enough people in America to make the product. But I mean, I could be wrong. This is the CEO saying we can't. We have to use skilled labor in other places. And they were looking in Vietnam and things like that. But that's what I've got on the Apple tariffs.
Well, I think in all of these situations where with the pushback with a lot of the pundits, the pushback is really there's no way it would take us 10 years, right? To gear up to make the transition, and to some extent, I think that is true. I say some extent because I think that if the companies and we as a country committed to that, then I think that the trajectory curve probably would be quicker than we realize. Mm-hmm. And you would have a lot of people, a lot of international people wanting to go through the immigration process in order to get jobs here, right? And to the point of Tim Cook's point, that the skilled labor thing may be an issue, but they're definitely also doing it because of the cost.
Yeah, I would think so.
And in terms of total costs, so I don't know the reality of bringing everything back home and how long it would take to get that. I think that the administration, bottom line, would work with any company that committed to doing that in terms of whatever they needed, the time it took, being able to do it slowly or in phases or whatever. So. It's just really whether there's a willingness to bring things back home on that. And it's again, as far as how the tariffs will affect the cost in terms of labor costs and all of that, it'd be interesting to see what are we talking about. $1,000 iPhone right now, does that mean it's going to be $2,000 or does it mean it's going to be $1,300? Right.
Well, I think the other thing too that. So again, I'm going to take more of an economist, kind of take a step back and look at this. Is what you've got going on, in my opinion, is a place where everybody's trying to make their opinion heard so loud that I think sometimes even in this instances we're missing communication, right? So go to the Trump administration. I'm going to do these tariffs. They're like, well, what you really have to look at, and I think what we've learned after this being now his second term is what is he trying to say, not what is he saying. Right? And yet what you have are people who are like, well, I'm just listening to what you're saying, not what you're trying to say. And with most people, you can do that, but not with Trump. It's more like watch what he does, not what he says, because what he says isn't, and that's a hard thing for people who really rely more on what you say. And I go to this point with Apple is like, are him and Tim Cook missing each other? Because that is the point. It's going to take 5 to 10 or maybe even a little bit longer. If you really, truly want to do this, it's not something that happens overnight. And if there is if we want to talk about a flaw in this administration, is his communication style comes out and basically sounds like, I'm going to do this if you don't do this tomorrow.
Right.
And then so the person who can't hear under that style goes, well, wait a minute, I can't do that tomorrow. Let me tell you all the reasons. So then they stop being able to communicate with each other. And that is kind of the real challenge, I think, that exists right now is the desire is probably, if you could get them in a room quietly to actually have communication in a way that they could communicate, probably is pretty close to the same. Hey, over the next 5 to 10 years, what would it take for us to get this here? Well, it would take this, this, and this. Okay, then how can we as a government support you in getting there? Can you imagine what would happen if we communicated that way? That's the thing that I think when I look at the future of where America needs to go, if you kind of ask me, I'm like, that's the reason it's going to go that way is because that's the way it needs to go. What we've got is flawed people on both sides involved as that communication dynamic. So maybe it takes a little bit longer, maybe it's a little bit rougher getting there, but everything's always goes where it needs to go.
I agree with you. I have an opinion on this in terms of Trump. I think that's part of his policy style. I think he on purpose.
He's a real estate guy.
I think he on purpose
maker.
Doesn't communicate on the public level of what is. I think on purpose he says tomorrow I'm gonna tariff you 100%.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't come to the table. And because I think from his perspective, that's what gets you into the back room together.
Well, I guess the reason, so why do I say that
so.
is because what everybody who's watching us have this conversation, the only thing they're seeing is the public side of what's happening.
Yeah, and everybody's reacting to that.
Correct.
But that's I'm just saying I don't think he cares. I mean everybody here.
But it's why it's important we have this conversation because when we go and make investment policy, if we start looking at this from an investment policy of what we think this could look like in 5 to 10 years, on what the real intent is versus the noise. Go back to noise versus news that we talk a lot about.
Yeah, that's right.
Like how. That's the real story of it. We're trying to bring U.S. manufacturing back to the U.S. and it can't be done tomorrow. It can't.
It can't. And I think I don't know. I don't know. I don't even know if any of this will work. I just suspect that he's wanting those backroom conversations.
I would agree. Well,
to actually get it worked out.
He mentioned he talks to Tim Cook all the time. He said that. I don't know if it's true. But here's the last thing I'll say on this topic, and I think Trump he wants a legacy, and he's not scared to do things that are scary for the economy, and so I'll tell you what he's seeing. The U.S. trade deficit with China was $280 billion last year, and Apple's iPhone production accounts for $50 billion of that. So that's 20%. So that's what Trump is seeing. And the only thing that pops in his head is like, all right, that can be made in America. And then I think that, like we were discussing, can that be like, can we start making some iPhones in America and then gradually make more and more and more until we get there eventually? And that seems to us like the most obvious solution to this is, can we do it gradually?
Yeah,
and I'm sure behind closed doors, that's the or at least I hope that would be the conversation. But so the Liberation Day tariffs, which is the 10% blanket on basically everybody, and then a couple various different ones, was ruled illegal by the U.S. Court of International Trade. And they said basically the administration overstepped its authority by imposing the tariffs without congressional approval, but the administration appealed the decision, and they will be allowed to activate these tariffs while waiting on the decision of the appeal. So they're ruled illegal, but they're still happening as of now. So that's where we're at.
And I think as we've kind of discussed, all the tariffs, just look at them as TBD until we know for sure what's
exactly
happening.
Yeah, and this is a whole interesting process. I think one of the things that I think it's important for us to pay attention to in the larger picture of this, not just the tariffs, but the judicial decisions on immigration, in terms of Trump's policies and his executive orders. Because what it's doing is it's engaging the three parts of our constitutional system, right? So the executive, judicial, and legislative, and so it's actually being engaged to test each other out, probably at a level unlike that's happened in a long time. So there's a sense in which this is actually pretty good, that. Whether the judge's rulings are good or not, I'm not going to comment on that. These things in terms of executive authority versus judicial authority versus legislative authority, that they're being tested out.
Yeah.
And which hopefully will bring some level of equilibrium in there at some point with this. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to quickly go through Asia and Russia and Ukraine so we can get to some of the other stuff. China and the EU met talking about semiconductor supply chain issues. Couple stats on that is China produces 15% of global chips, and EU right now is about 10%, and they want to double by 2030 to 20% of the global supply of chips, making the chips. The U.S. has a 50% market share of the entire global supply, our global economy in terms of chip design. And then, like I said, China's 15%, EU is 10%. Mm-hmm. And so they are kind of, seems to be deepening ties over there. So we'll see how that plays out. And then over in Russia and Ukraine, on at the very end of May, Russia launched its biggest attack on Ukraine, and that was about 1,500 drones and missiles that targeted Kiev and Ukrainian infrastructure, 200 civilian deaths there. And that attack followed Ukraine's usage of U.S. and U.K. supplied long-range missiles. And then Ukraine countered back on the 1st of June with drone strikes on 5 Russian air bases and damaging 41 bombers. And that was $7 billion in damages. So this is as intense as the war has gotten so far. This was, and like we were talking about, Trump says things, and then he said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. We knew he would try, and he did try, and he's still trying. He's doing his very best, but these two want different things, obviously, similar to the Gaza and Israel situation, but as of now, not looking good, but we don't have to spend too much time on that. So couple things I saw looking at the economy. So PCE inflation dropped to 2.1%. Fed's target for that is 2%. So we're basically there, and that's good to see. PCE accounts for things like groceries, restaurant meals, clothing, footwear, gasoline, rent, healthcare, education, and transportation. So it's stuff that consumers are actually spending to live. Those are living expenses. Right. So that's why I like it as a metric. And to see that at 2.1%, I think is a good sign. I think it's a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. I think we're not there yet, but we're
well, it's the danger, right? It's the danger of the fact that you've reached the target, and then do you say, okay, well, so all's clear now, and you run out. It's like, yay, we've accomplished it, and you haven't done enough. I mean, that's part of where Trump's coming out, I think even telling Fed today, like, you're too late in lowering interest rates. It's like, be careful, because if we lower interest rates at the wrong time, we could watch this number pop back up, especially as we still don't know what's going to happen.
We haven't seen this number that low, I don't think, at all this year.
No. You haven't seen that number this low in like 2 or 3 years. Right. It's been a long time, pre-COVID.
Right. So it's sort of like, can we keep it there for a little bit? Yeah. Can we see what happens? And the tariff revenues, something interesting to look at. We actually did. We brought in $22.3 billion in just May, doubling recent months and reaching $67 billion in tariff revenue to date. And then according to the Congressional Budget Office, where we're at now, if we keep the trajectory, tariffs could cut deficits by $2.8 trillion over 10 years. So that's over a 10-year period, but raise consumer prices by 1% to 2%. So that's sort of the trajectory that we're on. I just think it's
which is one reason I think if you look at that comparison, a reduction in trade. What'd you say? A reduction in trade deficit or a reduction in actual deficit?
Trade deficit.
Okay. So reduction in trade deficit versus a 1% to 2%. You're looking at 2% increase in inflation, right? I mean, if you that 2 to 3% is within the range of what long-term inflation is assumed to be anyway, a 1% increase. If they can keep the PCE down with tariffs only adding 1%, that's not a terribly bad trade-off for what they're trying to get on the other side. People may not like it, but that's what people are that's what the administration's looking at when they're making that call.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So.
And then as far as digital assets goes, this is a very interesting week, or 2 weeks really. We've got Circle IPOing, technically today, and they trade tomorrow. Circle is the USDC stablecoin.
Mm-hmm.
They've got about 40 billion in circulation, and BlackRock is going to own 10% of the.
That's what they're going to try.
Shares.
They're going to try, yeah.
Well, I think they can.
Yeah. Well,
so I think.
okay, they're going to own 10%.
I just think that highlights, the overall growing adoption and acceptance, really, of the digital assets industry. And if you're curious, I wrote this down because I actually didn't know myself. The way Circle, this USDC stablecoin company, makes revenue is they just take the assets that they back their coins off of, which is the US dollar, and just buy treasuries. So if they've got 40 billion in circulation and they've got, whatever the yield is right now, or that is their revenue. They just make interest off of their what they're pegging their coin to. So that's just really interesting to think about.
Well, it also gives you a view, right? So think of this as like the question has been like, what if China stops buying the currency? What if but they move to digital assets? Okay, well, what's the digital asset backed by? So if they're buying the currency, it's like, okay, this is an interesting thing to watch from a trade-off of people worrying about the devaluing of the U.S. dollar. I mean, I think we always have to potentially look at that risk. But as I've said quite often, I think the U.S. still is the cleanest shirt in the dirty laundry,
Even with the downgrade.
Correct.
Even with the downgrade.
And then over in Florida, I saw this, and I didn't know if it was true, if I was reading the right thing. But we're not there yet. But Florida is at least moving to eliminate capital gains tax on certain digital assets. So they're already known as one of the states with no state income tax. I think that obviously, I think this will drive a lot of people. There is a lot of people in Florida already that are in crypto. I think this will drive more people to crypto, and I think possibly even other states like Texas or Wyoming would kind of embrace this and see what Florida's doing, and possibly even do the same thing. But very interesting to see. That.
Well, it's one more piece, right? There's been things that have kind of incrementally happened that keep opening the door to validation and acceptance. So I think this is one more piece in that.
Yeah. And then, like I said, a lot of interesting stuff. So what's going on with, so there's an exchange called Kraken, which is similar to Coinbase. It's just a regular crypto exchange. And Solana partnered to make X stocks, which is literally stocks in the form of a tokenized digital asset.
Yeah.
So I was looking, I've got the Kraken app, and I was looking at these X stocks. So all the bigger companies, so Tesla, Nvidia, Amazon, Apple, etc., as well as just the S&P 500 are now tokenized, and you can just buy them on Kraken. And I'll tell you why it's a big deal is, first of all, trading is 24/7. It's digital assets. But you can also buy fractions. So if I don't have $6,000 to buy one share of the S&P 500, for instance, or if I even don't have whatever SPY is, $500, I could buy $1 a day of what, if I wanted to.
Well, what will be interesting is think about this from a bigger picture. So if you're a younger person or a person who, Harrison's not joining us today. He's our digital asset expert, but a lot of his assets are held in digital assets. They're not held in cash. They're held in, and so if he wants to pay rent, if he wants to do whatever, he has to convert to cash. If he wanted to invest until this came along, if he wanted to invest, he has to convert into the stock market. He has to convert to cash, open a brokerage account, and then buy what he wants to buy. What this creates is, you call it DeFi, right? Decentralized finance is the ability to participate in the equity markets without having to convert your assets out of cash or into cash from the asset. So again, it's another interesting thing to watch as the adoption of this continues on. It just shows the application in a different way than we've seen before.
But yeah, I think a lot of it's very popular in this industry for people to dollar cost average and buy fractions of, whatever asset, crypto asset, digital asset, daily or weekly or monthly. And the fact that you can now do that with stocks, I think, is really interesting.
Yep.
And we'll end off with a couple of the good headlines that I saw recently. First off, since 2000, global suicide rates have dropped 35%, though the Americas that's both North and South, saw a 17% rise. So that was, good globally. It's interesting to see that about the Americas, and I didn't look into it too much other than the article I read from Doomslayer was just giving the statistics. I couldn't really find any reason to why there was a 17% rise in the Americas versus the total 35% drop. Interesting to see, and from the global perspective, I think overall that's a very good thing.
Well, could I put out a hypothesis? I'd love
Sure.
for you guys to weigh in on what you think.
Sure.
So I think that what you have is kind of I'm going to look at it like a wave, right? So in extreme poverty and coming out of extreme poverty, there's a place of like hopelessness that could exist, right? So I can't do this for my kids. That's why you see child slavery and other things like that begin to happen when you're in extreme poverty. So that would be one point where you would find potential higher suicide rates. As you come out of that, not to extreme wealth, but if you just come into like general I'm able to pay my bills. I'm able to keep the electricity on. I'm able to enjoy. You watch happiness go up. You watch things, and we've seen the world do that. That would be my first comment, is we've watched the world come out of extreme poverty. But the other thing that we begin to see that I think COVID shined a light on is this overabundance of poverty to the point of boredom and uncertainty about purpose. And I think we're seeing that a lot more in the U.S. I think a lot of what we're seeing culturally and socially, interestingly enough to me, and a lot of different social movements and cultural movements are things just like, man, if we had more problems, that wouldn't be an issue. Who I identify as, how I think of myself, what I think my general purpose is. If we were struggling more, as we have more abundance and more prosperity, then, this is what I'm going to say. This maybe says it a little bit better. What I find is when you find areas with lack of purpose or lack of long-term, I think you see suicide higher. And so you find that in extreme poverty. And I think what we're seeing, especially as wealth has begun to expand, and we're even seeing that in wealth. I'd love you guys to comment, but that's my general observation.
I 100% agree, and I don't know what the statistics are, but I do know that psychiatrists, people like that, will quote these statistics showing that when people do have a sense of purpose, their chance of committing suicide is much lower than people who claim not to have that same sense of purpose or meaning in their life. And I think that, I guess to get a little bit personal, my dad's dad, my grandfather, we watched him kind of deteriorate from dementia. It's really interesting that he had no problem until his wife passed away. He sort of lost his purpose after that, and we watched him develop a disease almost instantly, like almost overnight after she passed away, and then die a few years later. And my theory behind it was, he lost his purpose. He now has no meaning. Of course, you can find meaning, but to him, he lost it. And that wasn't a suicide, but he developed a disease because he lost purpose, in my opinion. So I think that's a very good hypothesis, and I would definitely agree with that.
Well, I think if you pile onto that, I'm in the middle of a book called The Anxious Generation. It's actually a research-based book that tracks the mental illness of basically generation of people in line with when the iPhone was introduced. So basically the rise of social media, the rise of all that, so that you can, they actually track the growth of anxiety and mental illness with the growth of social media.
I wonder how much of that has to do with comparing yourself.
Well, just add that to what you just said, and it's like a pile-on in terms of kind of creating. So it's increased loneliness, it's increased dissatisfaction, it's increased.
I'm onto something here.
Yeah,
it has to do with relationships.
Oh yeah,
part of the ROI method,
and real
right?
connection,
Celebrating relationships and connection. It even brings it back to why that matters. Relationships help give you purpose.
There you go.
So our last
well landed.
Our last little piece of good news is that Americans in their 80s and 90s are, according to a study, healthier, happier, and less prone to dementia, which I just brought up. And that's just in the last few decades. We're seeing this, people in their 80s and 90s. So that's good news. That's what we want to see.
Interestingly enough, again, I made 52 this year. Drew can talk about his age if he wants to.
Maybe.
Kristina does not have to talk about her age. But I say that because we were watching the Dale Earnhardt video, story of Dale Earnhardt this last week, and watching that. And when Dale Earnhardt was like 29, he looked like he was almost like 60 or 50. I was like, man, I was looking at videos from like the 80s and 90s of him racing, and I'm like, man, everybody looks so old back then. And I think a lot of that has to do with the developments we've seen in technology and health and everything else. What a great time to be alive.
I think also less cigarette smoking too has a lot to do with that. People looking younger now.
Yeah, that's true. All right,
That's all I've got.
All right, with that, well, we've got another war. Kristina?
I don't have any. I was kept thinking, I'm like, what can I add? Y'all really just covered some good information today. And every time I was like, yeah, I'm going to add this, you guys covered it. And so I didn't want to sound like a broken record on a lot of those key points. I think I was thinking more along the lines of what Eric had come in from an economic standpoint, from the investment standpoint. And I think it was well conversated, and nothing further to add without, again, just doubling up on what you were going to say. So.
All right. Well, thank you.
Maybe next time I'll have more.
All right. Thank you all for joining us for another edition of The War Room. We'll be back in 2 weeks. God bless you. Have a great day.